Okay. So the title of my talk is Racial Ideology and is Political Ideology, the Incommensurability of Cuban Higher Education. And I wanted to give the talk and give the presentation an artistic theme, and it has to do with the fact that Afro-Cubanism in the 1920s in Cuba was a very radical moment in the history of Cuba, as far as having race connected to issues of progress. And so through arts and through the music scene and through the art world, through different forms of different genres of music, Afro-Cubanismo became a part of the national identity of Cubans. And so I wanted to start by showing the introduction slide is an artwork from Santiago Rodriguez Olazabal, who is a contemporary artist in Cuba. And I have two of his pieces. The first one, which is the introductory slide and will be used throughout the presentation, it's called Las Marcas de la Noche, and it's number 5. So I want to go ahead and get started with this artistic theme in discussion issues having to do with my project that I started in Cuba. So let me just go ahead and give some background. And you won't see titles like literature review or theoretical framework. I've named them something a little bit more creative to go with the artistic theme. All right. So I started this project thinking about my own identity as an Afro-Cuban and a refugee arriving in the US in the 1980s Mariel boat lift. And so my father was a political prisoner during the Cuban Revolution. He was a dissident, and he chose to leave Cuba with my mother and my 2 siblings and myself in 1980. And so this was a part of my history that I hadn't necessarily researched as a scholar. For a while, I was doing work having to do with the US and the domestic context that I was in New York. And a lot of my early work stemmed from my own personal experiences navigating the educational systems in the US. But I started thinking more about the Cuban system and decided to do a project in Cuba. But this background of the Cubans of Mariel was really forefront in my thinking, because there's so much that we don't know. So for example, in the slide here, I say between 1959 and 2020, approximately 60,000 Cubans died at sea after leaving the archipelago en route to the United States. And looking at some of these numbers, sometimes it's 60,000 and sometimes it's 125,000, because how do you document deaths in the ocean between Miami and Havana? And so I think that's an important, interesting fact to know as far as like issues having to do with Black geographies and having to do with post-colonial geographies, is that Black bodies at times, most of the time, there's always a blurring of fact. We don't necessarily have documentation of the deaths. And so I think it's important to ask questions. And for me, it was important to ask questions. Well, why in 59, when Fidel comes into power, why during the revolution do these mass exodus become a part of Cuba's future? And so based on the latest numbers, about 1 million Cubans have left Cuba from 1959 to 2020. And there was waves between 1960, 1970, 1980, and of course 1990 after the special period. And so in the 1960s and 70s, based on the research that I've been consulting, those waves were considered predominantly white, although there were Cubans of higher classes that were Black that did leave in the 70s and the 60s. But the 1980s, which was part of my exodus, really changed the conversation, because the 1980s, the Cubans who left were Cubans of color, Cubans who were called La Escoria, which is really kind of like the bottom of the barrel, or like the scum of Cuba. And they considered them, it was a large proportion was LGBTQ, and they were Black. And so this was an interesting shift in the racial dynamics of the exodus. And so when I started figuring out the dynamics of Mariel, I started asking questions about race and exodus in Cuba and the Cuban exile community. And so there's lots to think about. And then, of course, in relation to higher education. So let me move to the next slide. So yeah, so it brought me to start a project in Cuba. So from May 2018 to June 2019, I collected 23 oral histories and field observations in La Habana to understand the educational experiences of Havana Cubans. Preliminary results from this case study revealed that although higher education is free for Cubans, a majority of participants opted out of enrolling in the state's higher education system because they did not support Cuban political ideologies of the revolution. Other findings suggest that Black and mulatto Cubans who opt out of post-secondary education are arrested or imprisoned at higher rates than Cubans who earned university degrees. And I also want to give some context that I was born in Cuba, and my parents and my brothers, I left when I was 3, and then I didn't return again until 2004. And then from 2004 to 2018, within those 14 years, I traveled to Cuba between 10 days to 20 days, probably once every 2 years and sometimes every year. So I've really seen how Cuba has shifted and changed over time as far as in the last 14 years. And of course, having family, direct family, like niece, nephews, cousins, aunts, and uncles, learning from their experience also inform the research as well. So I'm calling this category paint because, as you can see, I'm layering the canvas. So canvas is the collection of data, and now we're going into the paint section, which is typically called the literature review. Okay, so Cuba's higher education system is widely recognized as a leader in equity and opportunity, as well as one of the best post-secondary education systems in Latin America. So during the Cuban Revolutionary period, Cuba was lauded for investing in universal education and for providing developing countries with medical doctors. So when you research Cuban higher education, what you find is a lot of statistics showing how Cuba is leading as far as Latin American higher education. And of course, and sending doctors to other developing countries, and investing in universal education. And so I think that's an important fact. And when I first started researching Cuba as far as the higher education system, this is what I thought. So when I came to Cuba with this context, I was assuming everything was good. You know, you have these assumptions, oh, everything's great. It's, you know, how lucky are Cubans? So I would ask, you know, Cubans like, wow, you know, in the United States. So I was made a comparison to the US. In the US, you know, we have to pay hundreds of thousands of dollars a year to go to university. And here it's free. And so through interviews and interviewing participants is when I will come to find out that free is in quotations, and there's a social cost to the freedom of Cuban education, of higher education. So let's embark on this journey. So some more literature here. So the role of higher education in the social, political, and economic foundations of Cuban society have been largely under-theorized. So because the Cuban government is not transparent with their data, so they don't collect census. So when I went to Cuba to begin the project, I usually start with a mixed method geographic approach to the research. So I wanted to know kind of neighborhood by neighborhood, what were the racial demographics, the SES demographics of people who lived in Havana. And I would come to find out that Cuba does not collect census data. And the small amounts of data that they do collect isn't something that they share widely with the rest of the world. So I started to learn that in Cuba, it's very a closed system. There's not an open system of sharing what they have as far as data. And so also Cuba's most recent constitution mandates that Cubans must support the state's political ideology as a condition of enrolling into the system of higher education. So some of my participants, when I would ask them about higher education, if they were, for example, if they had a religious affiliation. So before the Pope came to Cuba in the 90s, and I believe it was about 20 years, for about 20 years, Cubans weren't allowed to practice religion. And so not only were they not allowed to practice religion, if you were religious or if you had family that lived outside of Cuba, you weren't allowed to enroll in the university. So that blew my mind, because when I did the research, you couldn't find this information. And so when I interviewed actual Cubans, they would share. And I said, well, where's the policy? Well, when did it happen? I want to see the policy of, you can enroll in higher education if you have a religious affiliation. And they're like, there is no policy. That's what the rule was. And that's what we experienced for 20 years. It was very interesting for me to come to Cuba with particular ideologies of race and of education and of progress, and then learning from the participants that it's much more complicated than we think. Those of us who are academics, who live in the U.S., who are from the West, who are interested in learning about global South countries, especially Cuba. There's a lot that we don't know, and you don't find out until you go and actually do the research there. So some of the very small amounts of literature that exist on the Cuban higher education system and education, because there's not a lot out there, suggests that because of the political economy changing so rapidly in Cuba, that their educational needs as a society have to change. And also there is a large presence of anti-Blackness and segregation. And so that Cleland is someone that I cite both of her most recent pieces in this presentation, in this study. And they're very, very important when it comes to issues of race, because before Cleland, most of the work that was on Cuba or Cuban social policy or Cuban politics concluded that Cuba did actually provide equity for Black and white Cubans. And so I'm thinking of Alejandro de la Fuente's work, who wrote the book A Nation for All, who's at Harvard. He has a center on Afro Latin studies. His work says, Cuba between 1960 and 1980 did equalize employment and education for Blacks and whites. And so when he came to present in Missouri, I actually asked him a question. I said, well, what about 1980? What about when all the Black Cubans leave Cuba? Well, were the large percentage of Black Cubans and mulatto Cubans, like my family, when they decide to leave Cuba, why would they leave if they're so happy, if they're so content, if everything is fine? And so, I wasn't sure how he responded, but I think the Maria boat lift kind of illustrates that there was a huge flaw in the political system for Cubans of color and those who were marginalized. So this is based off of Cleland's newest piece in the Journal of Latin American Studies. So she says here, in Cuba, a university degree does not guarantee economic advancement, but rather family abroad, employment in certain sectors, or lucrative self-employment grant higher standards of living. Indeed, those who choose higher education, professional careers such as doctors, professors, engineers, and lawyers do not do so for the financial gain. And that was something that's true, and it's based on my data as well, that even if you have a university degree, it doesn't mean that you're not suffering the economic hardships of most Cubans. So now I'm going into the brush section, which is, I'm brushing theory into the literature and thinking about these ideas of ideology and constructions of ideology, and how racial ideology is shaped by the political leadership. And so I was really drawn to Gramsci's work. Gramsci does work on hegemony, but also did work on the state, really talking about issues of state power. Whereas Marx talks about capital, Gramsci really talks about the state power. And so I felt like that I needed to start doing some digging on some scholars who were Gramscian and started looking at some Gramscian theory. And so this was part of a piece that was critiquing someone who critiqued Gramsci and looked at how Gramsci's communism changed over time, the way he felt he was a communist. So this piece argues that we have to look at Gramsci's body of work to see that he had some alternatives to communism during the time that he was in prison. So from the time between 1929 and 1937, so he dies in 1937, that his political thinking, his thinking theoretically shifted on the Italian political system and the Russian political system during that time period. So even though he supported communism, he shifted his thinking on how he saw communism play out while he was in prison. And I also, in thinking about state power and thinking about the racial ideologies, I wanted to have a racial lens. And so Juliet Hooker's work on Afro-Latin American hemispheric thought really aligned with thinking about my own experiences having particular kinds of racial ideologies in my head, like very US-centric racial ideologies, in going to Cuba and thinking about race. And so I think it's really important, especially in this study, to take the perspective of understanding race as it functions within Latin America, and also understand that there's different forms of kind of racial hierarchy within Cuba than there was within the US, and that the political thinkers of the time, for example, the ones that she covers in her book on theorizing race in the Americas, she covers Du Bois and she covers Frederick Douglass on the American side, and then she covers Sarmiento and Vasconcelos on the Latin American side. So Argentinian political thinker and Mexican political thinker, and their thoughts on racial inequality during the later part of the 19th century for two, and then for the earlier part of the 20th century. And so kind of having conversations across these Americas to discuss issues of racial inequality. And so I think I want to take a similar lens in doing this work, is not necessarily comparing, but kind of reading the experiences of, of Cubans who are in Cuba, Cuban nationals, because I want to have another part to this study, which I'll talk about in a little after, but it's not just about Cuban nationals, also about those who left, right? So those who stayed, those who left. So the Cubans who actually came to the US, what were their educational experiences like as navigating a different kind of racial ideological system in the US. And so here, in looking at the perspective from the US and juxtaposing Douglass and Sarmiento, Hooker talks about how Douglass in the later part of the 19th century, so Douglass not only found exemplars of Black self-government and multiracial democracy in the Caribbean and Central America, he also sought to incorporate Black and mixed race Latin Americans into the US polity in order to reshape its contours and challenge white supremacy. So it shows that Douglass also had ideas of democratizing the way that racial politics was happening in the Caribbean and Latin America, but also looking at representation and seeing how during that time we could have high representations of people of color, of mixed race Latin Americans and Black Latin Americans within the US as well. I mean, he had these really grand ideas about immigration and kind of bringing Latin America and Black Latin America into the US. And Sarmiento, as far as Sarmiento, Hooker talks about the juxtaposition of Sarmiento and Douglass. So she says, both Douglass and Sarmiento romanticized the way race operated in the other America in the service of their own racial projects and political theoretical attachments. So similarly, I make this connection. I say here, Douglass romanticized Latin American racial politics and applied this thinking to US racial politics of the time. Sarmiento romanticized US racial politics during the Reconstruction period and applied this thinking to Latin America, right, racial politics. So I think Cuba during the revolutionary period is read or flattened by US racial politics as a racial utopia. So that's when I came to Cuba and started doing research on Cuba, colleagues of mine that consider themselves more on the political left had these assumptions about Cuba being a racial utopia for African Americans and for Black people. And much of it was due to seeing kind of things like, the fact that Cuba provided political asylum for Sada Shakur, or the military intervention of Cubans in Angola, saying that as far as them being part of Pan-Africanism. And of course, Fidel was one of the, based on the research, was one of the first leaders to talk about desegregating Cuba in 1959. So when other political leaders weren't talking about desegregating the country. And so what I'm finding though, in looking, and this project is going to take me probably a year or two to complete, especially if I add this component, this refugee component. What it's hard to find, and also it's hard to find even in the Cuban context, because a lot of the writings and a lot of the data that were collected before 1959 don't necessarily exist post 59. It's really hard to access data in Cuba. What I'm really interested in finding out is, and I read some work that suggests that for example, the 1940 Cuban Constitution was in 1940 was one of the most progressive constitutions in Latin America. Also, Cuba had one of the most active kind of Black and mulatto societies in all of the Americas. So there was, in Cuba, and especially in Havana, you could find dozens of societies across racial lines. So for example, African Americans had a lot of like clubs, not African Americans, Afro-Cubans had a lot of clubs, and they had a lot of, and there's some influence, and there was some research that suggests that Cubans during the Republic, Black Cubans during the Republic and mulatto Cubans during the Republic were instrumental in creating the 1940 Constitution that actually provided policies like affirmative action, policies that had to do with challenging racial inequality. You also have to know that the Cuban independence from Spain in 1899, between 1899 and 1901, was really the discourse of that period was a racial democracy discourse, right? Because the leaders of that independence were Afro-Cubans and white Cubans, right? So we have Antonio Maceo, who was a Afro-Cuban who was leading the fight as a soldier and a leader of the army. And then you had Jose Marti, who was a white Cuban intellectual who was way before his time, was already, discussing, the equality of the races. And this is 1899. So Cuba becomes independent on the thinking of equality across races. Of course, 1901 happens, the US intervenes in Cuba, and there is, some influence of white supremacy, US flavored white supremacy in Cuba during that time period. And so you do see kind of white supremacist hate happening during that time period of US style. Yet at the same time, I would argue that Afro-Cubans were doing a lot of organizing and doing a lot of work during the Republic period, and were becoming part of the political elite. So there was, middle-class Black Cubans or mulatto Cubans who were becoming part of the political elite. So much so that they were changing the Constitution. And so the 1940 Constitution is always always juxtaposed to the new Constitution that the Cuban Revolutionary Government has now. So there's a lot of historical data that I'm kind of researching and going through to make sense of what I don't know, which was, what was it really like for Black Cubans during the Republic? Because the assumption is, well, there was a lot of desegregation and it was bad for Black Cubans, which may be the case because that was the case in most countries in the 1950s. But was Cuba moving in a direction of racial equality with the policies that they had in place, right? So I would even argue, and I think there's some people debate me on this. Batista, who was the president of Cuba before Fidel, was the first Black president of a country in Latin America at that time, one of the first, right? Some people say, well, he wasn't really Black, he was mulatto. He was very, very fair mulatto. And so again, in Cuba, and part of the data that I'll show here is that there is a colorist system, right? That's not based on the Black-white binary, similar to the US. So there's these conversations that I'm having with other scholars who have written on the history of Cuba during the Republic, and then of course scholars who are writing in the revolutionary period. So my hypothesis for this study is that the Cuban revolutionary ideology is shaping inaccessibility to higher education for Blacks and mulattoes. And so Cuban Cuban higher education is really complicated. There's a lot, and it's based off the Russian model with a little bit of republic. During the Republic, there was more of a European American model of a higher education, and then in '59, it starts changing more to a Russian model. And so this, based on my research, looks more like a Russian model. So there's first level, which is primary, second level, which is secondary, and secondary to them is 7th to 9th grade, third level, which is pre and technical, and that is up to 18 years old. And so to get into university, that's superior, that's 5 years, and of course, master's and doctoral level. And so what's just very interesting is some of the research, Cleland's research recently, what she talks about as far as the variables on education, she actually puts together the third and the fourth level together. So she'll say, you know, Cubans who have university education or who have post-secondary education, they, you know, that their educational level does not influence their migration, because her piece is based on Black Cubans migrating. Why are Black Cubans migrating from Cuba, you know, for what reasons? And a lot of it is economic. But what I argue is just in the categorization of putting together pre and university. Pre does not translate to an associate's degree. First of all, look at the age of Cubans. Pre university is basically the last 4 years of high school for us. And so I think that to say that pre is post-secondary education is, it's not flexible enough to really share the realities of what Cubans are experiencing in pre and then university, and the differences in the accessibility of university. Pre is much more accessible. Most people go to pre. University is less accessible. And so to put them together, you really aren't getting a nuanced or sophisticated understanding of post-secondary education. And so here's my data. So I have 23 interviews. And so just for the purposes of this study and this presentation today, I'm focusing on those who went to university. So again, if you entered university, I'm not differentiating if you entered university and stayed for a year, or if you entered university and actually got a degree after 5 years. So just getting into university, I'm counting you in this university section. And then 12th grade or less is pre-university or less. So out of the 23, we have 9 who were in the university category, and then we have 14 who were in 12 or less. And so looking at the university category across race, what you see is that, for example, there is this component of getting into university that's called military formation. And the military formation part of it is based on talking to Cubans and based on participants and also based on observations and conversations that people have. The military formation style of getting into university is less rigorous. Some could argue it's less quality, but that's debatable. But there is less kind of merit attached to it. And so with university civil formation, there's more testing. And so what we find here is that it looks as if, based on this sample, that Black Cubans and mulatto Cubans, 75% of the ones who went to university did it through the military formation. So I think that's an important fact there. Also, that none of the Black university Cubans went through the civil side, right? And so another part that's interesting in this area is arrest and prison. So none of the university participants who attended university or got a university credential were ever arrested or had problems with the police or were imprisoned. Yeah, when we go to the other category of 12th grade or less, we see that out of those who were in this category, 50% of them were arrested and imprisoned. And when you look at that 50%, you see that 43% of the arrests were Blacks and 28% were mulatto. And so you see a racial discrepancy of arrests and prison associated with the 12th grade or less category. So again, I'm starting to ask questions about why this could possibly be, and how certain types of university kind of training is influenced by race. So this actually comes from the Ministerio of Higher Education, and off their website, most recent website. And so it says here, the Directorate of Vocational Training, and of course I translated because everything's in Spanish, so I may have some little mistakes with my translation, but please forgive those if you see any. The Directorate of Vocational Training methodologically directs the elaboration, development, and permanent updating of the theoretical foundations related to the integral training of future professionals in Cuban universities, so that graduates possess a strong ideological and social humanistic political culture and high professional competence to defend the revolution in the fields of ideas and fulfill any task entrusted to them. So we see here that clearly, just like in the Constitution and just like in their kind of like their mission, higher education is to serve the purposes of the state. So I'm going to talk about two participants in particular, two Black Cubans. The first is Adonis, and Adonis is 46. He's Black. He went to rural education schools from the ages of 12 to 18. And this was during 1986 and 1993, which is important because the special period was 1990. And so this was during a moment of economic crisis. And so he was also he was an oficial of the Fuerzas Armadas Revolucionarias, FAR. And this organization, when compared to El Ministro de Interior, which is the other part of it's like Homeland Security versus kind of frontline military, right? Frontline military in Cuba is predominantly Black and mulatto. And that's how he studied, was through FAR. So he's a substitute teacher. He studied engineering, but he sells Cuban cigars to the Black market to make ends meet. And that's how I met him. And I've known him for years. And that's typically the job the service that he does to make ends meet. And so, yeah, my category here is that there was a political conditioning of his higher education as a Black Cuban. So he talks here about his parents and what his parents did. And so he says, my parents, they were leaders, they worked. My father was party secretary, a Communist Party of Cuba, so PCC. He was a member there. My mother, the same. My mother was first secretary general of the syndicate union, so it's subordinate to PCC. The workers, we were a family, large but governed on values and principles of the system, of the revolutionary system, where we were instilled in principles. And just to continue, I have one more of Adonis, and then I'm going into another. So Adonis also says about his experience in the rural schools. I was on a scholarship. Being on a scholarship means you get sent to rural schools, where according to the possibility and conditions of your parents for work-related issues, etc., well, they enroll their children in that place so that they may have the possibility of being able to work and have less. It is an aid, because, well, being on those scholarships, being in those schools, which were called ESBC, Rural Basic High School, the people there, the students, the boys, we had lunch, food, breakfast. They gave us clothes for the cold, bedding for the bed. We were educated. They taught us how to clean and how to lay a bed. And so these schools were also schools that were boarding. So if you were on scholarship, you were living away from your parents 5 days a week for years. And so there was some research in news, because it's not always peer-reviewed journal articles on research on Cuban education is really hard to find, again, because you don't have the data. So sometimes you have to rely on news sources. And so there were some news articles talking about those Cubans who experienced this form of education, SBS, that talked about how they missed their parents and how it shaped their development as a young person, not being able to be with their parents. And typically those who were on scholarship were Cubans who were of lower means. So Cuba is still divided across class lines and across racial lines. And so it's important to note that although this form of education seems to be kind of egalitarian in a sense, those who would go to these schools were the poor kids. And so next is Elias is 45 years old. He's Black. He went to Urban Educational School. He went to San Alejandro, and he sells his art for a living. So he was arrested. He's one of the participants who did not have a university degree and has a 12th grade. So he has pre, but he doesn't have university. So he discusses how he's experienced racial profiling. So he says, and yes, I've been a victim of racial profiling. In 2007, the police, because I can't tell you precisely what policy informs the police, but I have been present. I have participated in conversations where there are people who have explained, persons who are tied to the Department of Interior, MINT, right? This is kind of the more predominantly white part of the military arm of the government, that to the police, that the police have it as a norm when they are training them. They inculcate that you have to stay on top of the Black population because most of the criminals are Black, which is not real, because who has really been looted? And so what I also found, and I'm starting to kind of theorize this, is that my participants that are 12, that have a less than a university education, it's really interesting how sophisticated their theorizations are about Cuba politically and racially. Whereas the ones that went through military formation and university, the interviews were much shorter, were more evasive, and weren't as rich. And so I'll continue with Elias, and you'll see kind of his theorization as he continues to talk about Cuba. So he says, and like that, they took me off the bus. They dislocated my shoulder, broken my things, accused me of being a pickpocket, without having an argument, because Blacks become white, the white target of censorship, the white target of, and that's sad. So in Cuba, in Spanish, to say target is blanco. So to say the blanco of censorship, you are saying target. But what's really interesting is that there's like a racial connotation to it. And it's very interesting how he phrases it here. So again, just showing the depth of theorizations that Cubans have that don't have university education. And so here, Elias talks about questioning the need of racial quotas in recent years of the Cuban Revolution. He says, maybe 5, 8, let's say 10 years ago, the government had to put in place a law which says they have to see at least 3 Blacks, 2 Blacks inside this, inside that, within this or the other. Is it for some reason? It is for some reason. That's shameful. I mean, I don't know what they are thinking about. What revolutionary equality are they talking about? So here he's kind of challenging these assumptions of this racial utopia, that in 59, Fidel came in and equalized the races across employment and education. And so what he's saying is, what equality are we talking about if you have to put in place kind of affirmative action or racial quotas in Cuba? And so he's saying it's shameful because, first of all, Cuba is a predominantly African, like it's predominantly Afro-Cubans, levels of Afro-Cubans, right? Mulattoes and Blacks. And this is another piece of Cleland's work that actually talks about how Cubans whiten their national statistics across race, right? So if someone is a mulatto Cuban, they may consider them white, right? So the actual reporting of Cuban racial statistics internationally, which would show that Cuba is 70% white Cubans, which is not, it's like the opposite. It's like 80% Black or mulatto Cubans. But again, there's this whitening, and Cleland actually has this from her data that she collected, that Cubans whiten their population, Cuban government whitens the population. And so that's also a part of what I'm arguing here too. So Elias, and this is the last piece on Elias on Blackness as an inclusion factor in Angola military intervention. Because I found Angola typically really interesting as far as challenging these ideas of Cuba being a Pan-Africanist, or at least bringing some critique to this move. So he says here, in the end, I didn't fully understand the Angolan War. It's a very altruistic story, but it cost a lot of Cuban lives, above all Blacks, because the first ones who were sent to Angola to confuse them with Black Africans were Black Cubans, coincidentally. Yes, because I don't want to think it was a malicious story, but indeed it happened, and there were many, and many were forced, not to tell you it was the vast majority. So of course here, you're left thinking, well, if this was an altruistic move, why segregate and send only the darker skinned people of your country, right? So I think that Elias brings that point up. So to conclude, I want to conclude and say that, so this preliminary analysis based on the 23 interviews, but focusing on just these two interviews that align with others, but just focusing on these two. That's why I'm calling it preliminary analysis. It reveals how Cuban political ideology has racialized access to university for Cubans, right? The Cuban Revolution is far from a racial utopia. Domestic higher education policy reinforces a racial hierarchy, right? The police state functions through anti-Blackness and contributes to higher education access. And military formation, less quality higher education, indirectly contributes to racial inequality. And I think this work is actually pretty groundbreaking because it also, there's this discourse in Cuba about the embargo and the US embargo and US imperialism. And so for every domestic problem a Cuban has, depending on if they are loyalists to the revolution, they would say, well, it's because of the embargo. It's because of the US imperialism. It's because of the embargo, right? And so although there's some reality to the conditions of Cuba having to do with some of the embargo and of the US imperialism, and that's for many countries in Latin America. There's also a component of the work that I'm doing, and I think also the work that's been done on race in Cuba, where you have to also the domestic policies and the current government does have to take accountability for their laws, for the way they're shaping the society internally and externally, because Angola was foreign policy, right? So I believe that my work is asking questions about domestic policy and the internal functions of race and how it functions with foreign policy like Angola that was racialized. So here's my references, and I want to end with this, and then of course it's my contact information, and I also talk about the artwork at the bottom by Santiago, and so I want to end with one of his last pieces, which is called Awo, and this was part of his 2018 collection, and just having us think about these ideas of racial and political ideology during Afro-Cubanismo, or thinking about Afro-Cubanismo in the sense of a pulling of a pulling kind of motion there. But that's it. If you have any questions, I'm here.
Thank you so much for that amazing presentation, Amalia. I know this is sort of an emerging project for you, so I feel really privileged to be able to witness you introducing it and thinking through it. So thank you so much. Whoever wants to ask a question, I think there's, I don't think there's any in the chat box yet, but you can put it there, or you can unmute yourself and ask a question. Maybe if you're going to speak, just introduce yourself a bit and then ask your question.
And I'll leave the artwork up for just a minute or two, just to be in the presence of such beauty. And I'll answer questions, and then I'll show my face.
I think we're all just processing.
No, that's fine.
But I hate to be the first one to ask since I'm the host, but since no one else is, I'm wondering.
That's fine.
If you can sort of say a bit about this dynamic that you identify really strongly and that I often see in research about internationalization or higher education research in general, or even research in general, which is we really like these kind of clean narratives about someone being the hero and someone being the bad guy, either individually or like in terms of whole countries.
Yes.
And so if someone is problematic, then the person who's their enemy must be amazing. And
yes.
I'm wondering if you can just say a bit about that dynamic and how we might interrupt it and complexify it, while also attending to the fact that there's sometimes, especially on the side of the more marginalized, like a hesitancy to open up that can of worms, because it's like, no, like you're already pathologizing us, so we need to, anyway.
Yeah, it's great question. And even with the obra, with the artwork, it's kind of like, you can see it as that way, right? You can see it like hero villain, right? Bad good. Yeah, because I do post-colonial work, I know that, right, that colonialism brought kind of these binaries of good and evil, and of, different ways that we understand our society.